Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to the final episode of JFK Jr., the man behind the myth. Before we get started, I do want to thank you for hanging with me through this whole series. It's been a very, very personal journey for me. As you probably know, if you've been listening to the series, John was a friend of mine for 8 years back in the 90s. So of all the Kennedy stories I've told, this one really hits home. And I hope you can feel that in my voice and in the words that I chose for the script. Now we're closing in on the last years of his life. In the previous episode, episode 6, we covered John's 20s and early 30s, those years when he was rather adrift. He was trying to find out what he wanted to do with his life, all the pressures he was under to pass the bar exam, to go into law, to do anything other than acting. His relationship with Daryl Hannah and several other women during those years, and his first meeting and early dating experiences with the woman who would become his wife, Carolyn Bessette. And we're going to pick up this episode where we left off at the end of episode 6, while Jackie Kennedy is battling non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and coming towards the end of her days. Please take a moment to like this video, share it, share that playlist link that's down in the comments with anyone that you know who's interested in the life and times of my friend John F. Kennedy Jr. The date, May 1994. The place, 1040 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York. By early May, the pain Jackie was feeling was simply unbearable. John told his friend, Stephen Stiles, that Jackie phoned him up and sobbed, "I don't think I can take it anymore." John coped with the stress the best way he knew how, with physical activity. He spent even more hours at the gym, on his bicycle, running through the park. On one of those runs, he took Daryl's dog with him. As John was returning to her co-op on the west side, he wasn't paying close enough attention, and a car struck and killed the dog. Daryl was justifiably upset at John's heedlessness, one of the strains in their already complicated relationship, but she had no desire to make him more miserable than he already was. On May 15th, a Sunday, Jackie took Maurice's arm and embarked on one last walk through her beloved Central Park. She wore tan slacks, a long-sleeved pink sweater, a brown wig, and a scarf wound tightly around her neck. Caroline, pushing a stroller with one hand, walked a few steps ahead. Slowly, they made their way toward the 840 acres of winding paths and woods and lawns and lakes that Jackie had known since she was a toddler. But the entire time, Jackie was grimacing in pain. She managed only a few halting steps past the park entrance before having to turn back. Weak and disoriented, her speech slightly slurred, Jackie was back in New York Hospital the next day. She was diagnosed with pneumonia, but tests also showed that the cancer had now spread to her liver, which meant that any further chemotherapy or radiation treatments would be futile. In the short run, however, they urged her to remain in the hospital while they administered antibiotics in an attempt to at least bring her pneumonia under control. John knew what his mother would do next. With no interest in prolonging the inevitable, she checked herself out of the hospital. With Maurice holding her hand, she was taken by ambulance to 1045th, then wheeled into the building on a stretcher. By nightfall, hundreds of camera crews, reporters, photographers, and the just plain curious pressed up against the blue police barricades set up on the sidewalk in front of Jackie's building. On May 18th, family and friends received the call they had all been dreading. Jackie's longtime housekeeper, Marta, told them all to waste no time getting to 1045th. Jackie's stepbrother, Yusha Auchincloss, got the call at Hammersmith Farm in Newport and drove straight to New York, praying that he would make it on time. As you can imagine, Nancy Tuckerman said, it was a very emotional time for everyone. Caroline was too distraught to even function. She sat on a bench in the hallway, gently weeping with Ed Schlossberg at her side. It was left to John to greet visitors as they stepped off the private elevator and into the foyer. That night and throughout the next day, John, Caroline, and Maurice took turns at Jackie's bedside. Daryl Hannah, on hand to lend John some moral support, tried to stay in the background. John and his sister read to Jackie from her favorite works of literature. At times, they sat with her together in the room, sharing treasured memories in hopes that their mother could hear them. Meanwhile, Jackie, her head wrapped in a printed scarf, slipped in and out of consciousness. John's aunt, Lee Radziwill, arrived that night, followed by Ted Kennedy and his second wife, Victoria. When she emerged from her sister's room hours later, Lee was weeping. Solemn-faced as he left for the night, Ted told the reporters outside, "All the members of the family love her very deeply. We just wanted to be with her tonight." Moments earlier, Jackie came to long enough to see that everyone, John and Caroline in particular, was exhausted. "It's late," she whispered to John. "Go home and get some sleep." They did, but returned 2 hours later. It was shortly after noon on Thursday, May 19th, when Jackie received the last rites. When John's Uncle Bobby lay dying in Los Angeles 26 years earlier, family and friends were allowed to come into his hospital room in groups of 2. Once again, they filed in 2 at a time. Aunt Eunice and Uncle Sargent, Carly Simon and Bunny Mellon, Ted and Victoria, Aunt Pat and Aunt Ethel to sit by Jackie's bed, hold her hand, and even share some bits of gossip. Waiting their turn to say goodbye, family members and friends stood in the living room, murmuring softly to one another. Periodically, someone would start to cry, and John would put a comforting arm around them. Yusha Auchincloss had arrived just in time to spend most of the evening there. But first, I had to compose myself, he said. I told John that I didn't want Jackie to see me upset. I went in and out of her room for short visits over the next few hours, sitting by her bed, holding her hand, whispering some memories of our childhood. Then I kissed her goodbye. Jackie had lived life to the fullest. She had no regrets. That night, Jackie lay in her bedroom, bathed in the gentle glow of 3 antique lamps. Even in her drug-induced sleep, she struggled for breath. Every 20 minutes, a doctor came in to check her vital signs and, in accordance with Jackie's wishes, administered just enough morphine to ease her into as painless a death as possible. While Caroline sat in the next room, Maurice and John took turns sitting in a chair next to Jackie's bed. Physically spent and emotionally drained, Maurice left her room for just a few minutes to go out and get some air. When he returned, Jackie had slipped into the final coma. An hour later, at 10:15 p.m., on May 19th, 1994, Jackie's heart stopped beating. It had all happened with such mind-spinning swiftness. It had only been 4 months since the public learned of her illness, that everyone was struggling to comprehend what had just happened. She just, said Nancy Tuckerman, sort of slipped away. Outside, the world waited for any news concerning Jackie's condition. Initially, Uncle Ted argued that a formal statement should be issued by Nancy Tuckerman. Caroline objected to making any kind of announcement. "We don't owe them anything," she told John. John, who had always been more media savvy than his sister, disagreed. He suggested that the best way to break the news was for a family member to speak directly to the press, telling the circumstances of Jackie's death and then asking for time to grieve. The next morning, John stepped before the scores of reporters and photographers camped outside the building where he had grown up. "Last night, at around 10:15, my mother passed on," he said. "She was surrounded by her friends and family and her books and the people and things that she loved. And she did it in her own way, and we all feel lucky for that, and now she's in God's hands. There's been an enormous outpouring of good wishes from everyone in both New York and beyond, he went on, and I speak for all our family when we say we're extremely grateful, and I hope now that you know we can just have these next couple of days in relative peace. Needless to say, that didn't happen. True to form, hundreds of onlookers who had gathered in the street strained to catch a glimpse of John, Caroline, and Maurice as they got into a limousine and sped off for the nearby Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel. There they picked out Jackie's coffin, the presidential model, dark mahogany with gleaming pewter handles, and discussed funeral arrangements, at least the few they could agree on. Once back in the apartment, Uncle Ted began quarreling with Jackie's children about the size of the funeral. Caroline wanted it to be a modest, private affair, but the senator insisted that Jackie was simply too important to figure for that. He argued for a funeral at New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral to rival that of Robert Kennedy in 1968. John remained neutral, focusing instead on hosting the wake that was now taking place in the apartment and on small details that he felt his mother would have thought were important. John had his mother's coffin placed next to the fireplace in the living room, and then gently arranged her gold-embroidered bedspread over the closed lid. "We need something intimate," he explained, "to dress things up." The woman who had so meticulously planned JFK's state funeral had given their children substantial latitude in arranging hers. She specified only that she wanted the service to be conducted at St. Ignatius Loyola Church, and that she wished to be interred next to Jack at Arlington National Cemetery. Showing the gumption she had inherited from her mother, Caroline got her way. There was one small concession. Speakers would be set up outside St. Ignatius Loyola so that the people gathered on the street would be able to hear the service. John, who had already shown such composure and grace in announcing his mother's death to the world, was now assigned the task of drawing up the guest list. "It's fine," he told Daryl. "I just want to keep busy." As far as Jackie was concerned, Daryl was the last serious woman in her son's life, and the one who, despite Mummy's disapproval, was likely to land him as a husband. That Sunday, she and John, both wearing shorts and T-shirts, caused photographers to scatter as they rollerbladed up Fifth Avenue on their way to Jackie's hastily arranged wake at 10:40. Many Americans who were having a hard time coping with the suddenness of Jackie's death were offended by the sight of John skating around town with his movie star girlfriend. Yet it was all completely in keeping with family tradition. John felt he was honoring his mother by doing what he loved, because he knew that's what she would have wanted, John Perry Barlow said. Besides, added Larry Newman, all the Kennedys run out and do something physical at times like these. More than 100 people came to the wake, and hundreds more gathered outside on the sidewalk. The guests, most of whom appeared to be in a state of shock, sipped Perrier from wine glasses and absent-mindedly nibbled on watercress sandwiches with the crust cut off. John took on the role of official greeter, breaking away periodically to talk for extended periods with his cousin and best friend Anthony Radziwill and old friends like Billy Noonan. At one point, John rushed to the aid of an elderly woman, one of Jackie's old society friends who had passed out. "It was incredibly stressful," Nancy Tuckerman said. "Everyone was in a daze." At one point, John took Daryl out to the 14th floor terrace to wave to the crowd below, at which point the crowd began singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Joining his friend outside, Billy Noonan told him that Jackie was more than a first lady to the people gathered below. She was an icon. She was their queen. John smiled and nodded. On a clear, sunny Monday morning, Jackie returned to St. Ignatius Loyola, the church where she had been baptized and confirmed. To the tune of the hymn, "We Gather Together," the heavy casket, covered with a spray of lady's mantle, was carried up the steps of the church by 8 pallbearers, 7 of Jackie's nephews, and John Walsh, the Secret Service agent who had become a father figure to John as well as Caroline. Former First Lady Lady Bird Johnson and the current First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton were among the hundreds of politicians, artists, writers, business leaders, social lions, fashion icons, and entertainment figures gathered inside the church. The ceremony was planned around readings from the scriptures and poems that John hoped would, quote, capture my mother's essence. He explained that 3 elements in particular had come up again and again, quote, her love of words, the bonds of home and family, and her spirit of adventure. There was never any doubt that Ted Kennedy would once again be called upon to deliver the eulogy. No one else looked like her, spoke like her, wrote like her, or was so original in the way she did things, he said. Harking back to Dallas, he pointed out that, quote, she held us together as a family and as a country. In large part, because of her, we were able to grieve and then go on. She lifted us up, and in the doubt and the darkness, she gave her fellow citizens back their pride as Americans. Jackie's love for John and Caroline was, he continued, deep and unqualified. She reveled in their accomplishments. She hurt with their sorrows, and she felt sheer joy and delight in spending time with them. At the mere mention of their names, Jackie's eyes would shine and her smile would grow bigger. From the church, the cortege made its way through Manhattan traffic and on to LaGuardia Airport, where John led the rest of the funeral party onto a chartered plane. President Bill Clinton was on the tarmac at National Airport to meet the 737 jetliner bearing Jackie's body when it arrived in Washington at 1:30 p.m. From there, the motorcade of minibuses, limousines, and police motorcycles escorted the hearse through the black iron gates of Arlington Cemetery. It had been 31 years since John and Caroline had watched their mother light the eternal flame here. Now it blazed in the brilliant sunlight as President Clinton spoke. Quote, in the end, she cared most about being a good mother to her children, he said, and the lives of Caroline and John leave no doubt that she was that and more. May the flame she lit so long ago burn ever brighter here and always brighter in our hearts. The children each gave brief readings, first Caroline, then John. Then, as 64 bells rang out from Washington's National Cathedral, one for each year of Jackie's life, they knelt down and kissed their mother's coffin. Caroline, her head bowed, stepped back, but John walked a few steps over to the spot where his father lay, and leaning forward, reached out to gently touch his gravestone. There was no hiding the depth of Caroline's grief. Her face had been tear-stained and etched with sorrow for days. But John had revealed nothing of his feelings, never allowing that well-worn Kennedy mask of stoicism to slip. At this moment, it all finally came crashing down on him. It had always been the 3 of them against the world, and now Mummy was gone forever. With the right hand that had saluted his father more than 3 decades before, John reached up and brushed a single tear from his cheek. He said, a person never really becomes a grown-up until he loses both his parents. Front and center now was the administration of his mother's $150 million estate, the bulk of which was to be divided between her children. Maurice had just begun briefing John and Caroline on the task that lay ahead, finding a way to pay the steep inheritance taxes, which could easily top $30 million. John and his business partner, Michael Berman, were also fully committed to getting George off the ground. And since John had no intention of investing a penny of his own money in the magazine, Maurice and Jackie made him promise that he wouldn't, and that meant finding a backer with very deep pockets. No longer willing to wait, Daryl Hannah, according to several of her friends, got down on one knee and proposed to John herself, Apparently, the second time she'd tried this ploy, she was also waxing romantic about her days with Jackson Browne. In fact, during Jackie's wake, jaws dropped as Daryl insisted on telling everyone about her first meeting with Jackson Browne, how he picked her out of a concert audience and pulled her up on the stage. All of this in earshot of John, who was still reeling from the loss of his mother only hours before. "Don't push me," John replied to these increasingly desperate pleas, nor was he particularly moved by her none too subtle hints that she might return to Jackson Browne. "I don't respond to ultimatums," he told her. By July, it was over. After 6 years, Daryl Hannah made the extraordinary decision to return to Jackson Browne. John, meanwhile, returned to an old love of his own, Jules Baker, the head-turning model who looked so much like Jackie. 2 months later, Baker was John's date at the wedding of his favorite cousin and closest friend, Tony Radziwill, now an ABC News producer, and Tony's colleague, Carol DeFalco. The wedding took place in a white clapboard church in East Hampton, New York, and once again, John was best man, a favor Tony would later return. The event was an especially joyous one for John, since only a few years earlier, Tony had fought and won a tough battle against testicular cancer. Sadly, the cancer would return with a vengeance within days of Tony and Carol exchanging their wedding vows. For the moment, John's main concern was once again how to juggle all the women in his life. He was still seeing Carolyn Bessette, a close friend of Baker and the bride, although at this point, Jules seemed to have the inside track. "Jules looked so much like Jackie, it was eerie," said one of John's friends. Did being with her provide a way for John to, in a sense, hang on to his mother? He just wasn't ready to let go, not completely. I'm sure he wasn't consciously aware of it, but there was something of Jackie in all of the women he was serious about. "I was always there for him," Jules said, "and he was always there for me. But that was the problem. The woman who most intrigued John was the one who, at least for now, played hard to get. While he was squiring Baker to high-profile events all over New York, John was also stealing some quiet moments with Carolyn. She was a very strong one-on-one person," said John's friend Richard Wise. John always found her provocative. On one of those occasions, when Carolyn chose to make herself available, John took her on a tour of the waters off Hyannisport aboard his powerboat, the PT-109. Facing into the wind like the ship's figurehead that hung from his wall at Brown, John's thong-clad passenger wiggled into a skirt with a little help from the skipper, and then asked him to carry her ashore so she wouldn't get wet. He happily obliged. "She knows how to handle men like practically nobody I've ever met," John Perry Barlow said at the time. "She knows where all the levers are, and she is very deft in her operation of them." In that sense, she was indeed very much like John's mother. Jackie was a skillful listener, JFK's pal Chuck Spaulding observed. She had this way of focusing on you with those enormous brown eyes and hanging on your every word, so the rest of the world just sort of fell away. Men, needless to say, tended to find this irresistible. Like Jackie, Carolyn had a genuine appreciation of men, John Perry Barlow said, adding that she was, quote, "extremely female." And I think it was only appropriate that there would be a lot of voltage across that gap. She is hardwired to relate to people who are male. Jackie and Carolyn also shared an aristocratic bearing that at times bordered on the aloof, a unique sense of style, and a carefully nurtured aura of mystery. In contrast to John, who smoked a single cigarette a day as a point of personal discipline, Carolyn, like Jackie, was a chain smoker. Carolyn made no effort to conceal her near-obsessive need for order and control, another Jackie trait, which served as a counterpoint to John's easygoing way and sloppiness. Back at St. Mary's Catholic High School, Carolyn broke her share of hearts on the way to being voted the ultimate beautiful person by her classmates. "She's passionately sexy," said Eugene Carlin, a jock that she dated off and on throughout high school. He called her beautiful, sophisticated, tough, driven. She can drive you nuts. Carolyn graduated from Boston University in 1988 with an education degree, but had no interest in pursuing a career in that particular field. Instead, she set her sights on more glamorous pursuits, first as a publicist for nightclubs in the Boston area, then as a model. In 1990, she struck a number of seductive poses in leather, lace, and denim for a series of jeans ads that never ran. Around the same time, Carolyn's parents cut her off after she maxed out her credit cards, and she went to work as a salesperson in Calvin Klein's Boston store. Tapped by senior management to handle celebrity clients, Bessette moved to New York and promptly befriended the designer, his wife Kelly, and their daughter Marcy. A denizen of New York's nightlife, she often partied until dawn at fashionable night spots. As a publicist in the fashion industry, she was also invited to snort the occasional line of cocaine. Carolyn's job at Calvin Klein also meant that she remained in close contact with Michael Bergen. She was instrumental in getting his modeling career off the ground, and the torch that Bergen once carried for her still smoldered. Understandably perturbed by John's dalliances with other women, as well as his irritating habit of showing up for their dates late or sometimes not at all, Carolyn was not above using her hunky friend to make him jealous. Unlike so many of the other women he encountered, Carolyn clearly was no pushover. She'd been hired by Calvin Klein to handle celebrity clients because she didn't appear to be intimidated by anyone, and John was no exception. Carol Radziwill remembered a favorite phrase of Carolyn's when she thought of something that was absurd. "I don't think we'll be doing that," and how, like John, Carolyn stabbed at the air with her hands when she was making a point. "Most women sort of become tongue-tied around John," his college buddy Richard Wise said. But that wasn't Carolyn's problem. She was very strong-minded and knew what she wanted, and had absolutely no difficulty speaking her mind. As besotted and bewildered as he was by Carolyn, John had other pressing matters to attend to, not the least of which was the disposition of Mummy's estate. Jackie had named Maurice and her lawyer, Alexander Folger, as executors, but ultimately it was up to John and Caroline to see that her final wishes were carried out. It was no surprise that the bulk of their mother's estate was divided equally between Caroline and John. In a final snub, she made no provision for her envious sister Lee, quote, "because I have already done so during my lifetime." However, she left $500,000 in trust to each of Lee's children, Tony and Tina. Jackie also bequeathed $250,000 to Nancy Tuckerman and $50,000 to her longtime maid, while $100,000 went to another niece, Janet Auchincloss Rutherford's daughter, Alexandra. Even in death, Jackie did what she could to ensure that her children were safe. She had asked that her chief bodyguard, former Secret Service agent John Vigiano, prepare a list of security risks to John and Caroline. His chilling report, attached as an addendum to Jackie's will, named several stalkers, including a Brooklyn man who was convinced that he, not Ed Schlossberg, should be married to Caroline, a convicted wife-beater who was convinced he had been married to Jackie and was the real father of her children, and, most terrifying of all, the double murderer who appeared at the front door of 1040 to declare his love for Jackie and the children. The mental instability of many of the individuals involved, her bodyguard concluded, and the harassing nature of their communications represent a significant threat to the personal security of Mrs. Onassis's descendants. Neither John nor Caroline thought there was much they could do about the threats, other than try to keep their precise addresses out of the newspapers. "If some nut out there wants to do something," John said, echoing his father's prophetic words, "there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not going to live my life worrying about things I can't control. If anything, John was moved by the outpouring of affection from his fellow New Yorkers in the wake of his mother's death. The city moved swiftly to rename the former High School of Performing Arts on 46th Street, the inspiration for the 1980 movie Fame and the television series that followed, as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis High School. Even more gratifying to John was the city's decision to name the Central Park Reservoir after her. She was as much a part of this park, said one park worker who had watched her take her runs along the jogging path, as this body of water. Then there was 1040. Since Caroline's family was firmly rooted in their apartment on Park Avenue, it seemed logical for John to move into the stunning Fifth Avenue apartment he had always called home. But he couldn't. Too many memories, he said. Can't handle it. Instead, John set up housekeeping far away from the Upper East Side in a 700,000, 2,600 square foot 10th floor penthouse co-op at 20 North Moore Street in Tribeca. Since neither John nor Caroline had any intention of actually using 1040, Maurice urged them to sell it. In January 1995, billionaire David Koch bought Jackie's apartment for $9.5 million, all of which went to pay estate taxes. By 2014, David Koch would be the fourth richest man in the United States and New York's wealthiest citizen. He and his older brother Charles would be best known for bankrolling conservative causes. Caroline could not bring herself to watch the movers empty the apartment of her mother's belongings, but John sat alone on the curb across the street and watched the transition without saying a word. That's the kind of thing you'd expect John to do, John Perry Barlow said. John was a very sentimental guy. A few days later, John suffered another loss when his grandmother Rose died at the age of 104. In reality, John had never been especially close to the Kennedy matriarch. Jackie kept John in particular away from Rose, said Rose Kennedy's secretary, Barbara Gibson. Jackie didn't want the children to be too Kennedy. I noticed that she felt most strongly about John not being too close to his grandmother. Jackie seemed to want to keep him really close to her. In the end, it worked, because although Caroline and Rose were close, writing to each other regularly, Rose hardly had much to do with John at all. On January 25th, 1995, John and Caroline were among the hundreds of mourners who attended Rose's funeral at St. Stephen's Church in Boston. The eldest daughter of legendary Boston mayor John Francis Honey Fitzgerald and the wife of one of America's wealthiest men, Rose attended Mass at Stephen's every Sunday and always placed a single dollar bill in the collection plate. Over the previous 6 months, Random Venture co-founders John and Michael Berman had also been passing the collection plate, trying to raise some startup capital for George. Finally, in March 1995, Hachette Filipacci, publishers of 22 magazines ranging from Women's Day to Road and Track, agreed to bankroll George to the tune of $20 million over 5 years, or until it turned a profit, whichever came first. Caroline was still wary of George, seeing it mainly as just another way for someone else to trade on the family name. About this, John had no illusions. Despite his frequent protestations that George isn't about me, of course it was, and he knew it. Having John Kennedy as editor-in-chief, said Hachette's bottom-line-driven U.S. chief David Pecker, is going to be a big benefit to the magazine. He has access to almost everyone. John's unsurpassed celebrity status certainly gave him an upper hand in journalism's game of the get. It was difficult to imagine the movie star or politician who wouldn't at least take a call from JFK Jr. Even more important was JFK Jr.'s value as a frontman for the magazine, as well as a magnet for subscribers and advertisers. In the end, Pecker and Hachette would wind up reportedly sinking millions more than the originally promised $20 million into George. That, said one Hachette executive, is how charming John could be. As eager as John was to try his hand at journalism and on his own terms, George served another important purpose. For years, John had been pressured by party operatives in Massachusetts and New York to run for office, and for years he had skirted the issue. "You'd better be damn sure it's what you want to do," he said, "and that the rest of your life is all set up to accommodate that. It takes a certain toll on your personality and on your family's life. I've seen it personally. So if I were to do it, I would make sure that it was what I really wanted to do, and that I didn't do it because people thought I should." George was a tentative first step towards a life in politics. I didn't understand why movie actors were the only ones who could sell magazines, and why people in entertainment were the only heroes of pop culture, John said. I thought if I could parachute behind enemy lines in a way and join the journalistic profession, that I could begin to let my perspective about politics seep in and maybe influence the presentation of politics. John hastened to remind his critics that his father had covered the founding of the United Nations in 1945 as a working reporter for the Hearst newspaper chain. "For me," John explained, "the marriage of publishing and politics simply weaves together the two family businesses." 1 month after Hachette inked its deal with Random Ventures, Carolyn moved in with John. She had her work cut out for her. John's Tribeca loft was an industrial space when he bought it, and he paid an architect over $300,000 to transform it into a stylish bachelor pad. What he ended up getting was actually just an industrial space with a kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 office, 2 very basic bathrooms, and 2 small closets. It was badly lit and furnished with pieces from 1040 that just didn't match. Carolyn called the place the warehouse, or alternately Home Depot. While the new woman of the house thought of ways to make it a little more livable, John was putting in 15-hour days on the launch of George. As the September deadline approached, he was looking pale and drawn. In the span of just 3 weeks, he dropped 15 pounds. During a run with his friend Gary Ginsberg, who had come aboard as an editor at George, John collapsed. At one point, Ginsberg looked back to see his friend gasping for air, slumped against a tree. Carolyn Bessette and Caroline were worried. In view of his father's history of Addison's disease, a potentially fatal autoimmune disorder, and Jackie's lymphoma, the women in John's life urged him to see a doctor. John checked into New York Hospital, and after undergoing a series of tests, phoned Caroline with the news. John was suffering from Graves' disease, an incurable hyperthyroid condition. John quickly brought that disease under control with drugs that, he was told by his doctors, he would have to take for the rest of his life. On September 1st, John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Dropping to one knee, he opened the box to reveal a sapphire and diamond band. This was a copy of Jackie's favorite everyday piece of jewelry, designed for her by Maurice Templesman. Since she wore it everywhere, even in the water, Jackie called it her swimming ring. "Will you marry me?" he asked Carolyn. Carolyn was speechless. She later told Carol Radziwill that she was taken by surprise, even though by this point she knew a proposal was inevitable. She also felt at the time that while the ring was nice and she appreciated its sentimental value, it certainly wasn't the engagement ring she would have picked out for herself. John expected to hear an immediate and resounding yes, but he didn't. Instead, Carolyn demurred. "I'll think about it," she replied, only half in jest. If he was hurt by Carolyn's reluctance to say yes, the tabloids were reporting the rumor that she was stringing him along. John gave no indication of it. When Carolyn dropped into the George offices, magazine staffer Richard Blow recalled that John was ecstatic. He would gaze upon her as if he couldn't believe what his eyes were taking in. He couldn't stop touching her, running his fingers through her hair, stroking her arms. Carolyn seldom responded in kind, he noticed. Carolyn's puzzling reluctance to commit to John and his Graves' disease aside, he looked confident and fit as he waited to step before more than 200 reporters on the morning of September 8, 1995, to announce the birth of George. The setting, New York's neoclassical Federal Hall, was chosen by John for its historic significance. It was here that George Washington was first sworn in as president in 1789. Carolyn had helped him pick out the dark blue suit he wore for the occasion, but one sartorial touch, a pocket square, was distinctly his. John wore a pocket square for luck when he considered an event particularly important. Worried that reporters would simply bombard him with questions about his private life, John had already tapped Clinton's spinmeisters Paul Begala and Michael Sheehan for advice. By way of rehearsal, they staged a mock press conference, peppering John with potentially embarrassing questions. You failed the bar exam 2 times. Are you lazy or just stupid? Who is your new girlfriend? Do you wear boxers or briefs? At the unveiling, Michael Berman spoke first. I feel a little bit like Barry Manilow right before introducing Bruce Springsteen, he quipped. Being John Kennedy's partner, Berman continued, is a lot like being Dolly Parton's feet. It's nice, but you tend to get overshadowed. John then walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, meet George. Out swung a mounted display of the cover, supermodel Cindy Crawford, as a bare midriffed, bewigged George Washington. In a seldom-seen gesture, the reporters actually burst into applause. I don't think I've seen as many of you in one place, John said, since they announced the results of my first bar exam. After conceding that he hoped to wind up as president of a very successful publishing venture, John volunteered answers to a series of personal questions before anyone could ask them. Yes, no, we're merely good friends, none of your business. Honest, she's my cousin from Rhode Island. I've worn both. Maybe someday, but not in New Jersey. Now that his audience had been completely won over by his disarming self-deprecation and easy grace, John explained what he hoped to accomplish with George. Politics isn't dull. Why should a magazine covering it be? Politics is about triumph and loss. Politics is about the pursuit of power and the price of ambition. As for John's insistence that George would be nonpartisan, Uncle Ted said, John, if I'm still talking to you by Thanksgiving, you're not doing your job. How do you feel about joining the media? One reporter blurted out, that has made your life hell. John cocked his head and smiled. You didn't make my life hell, he replied. What would your mother say if she could see George? Someone else called out. The room fell suddenly silent. John took a moment and then admitted that he was glad she wasn't at the press conference because it would have made him nervous. But he added, my mother would be mildly amused to see me up here and very proud. In addition to being the face of the magazine, John agreed to contribute an interview to every issue, a regular feature that, given his ability to woo practically anyone, was a cornerstone of George's editorial content. The first issue contained John's interview with wheelchair-bound George Wallace, the firebrand former governor of Alabama who had been shot and paralyzed in an assassination attempt in 1972. There was also a piece by John's old flame, Madonna, titled, If I Were President. Keeping up his end of the bargain, John produced news-making interviews with the divergent likes of Fidel Castro, that actually never ran in the magazine, Garth Brooks, Louis Farrakhan, and 2 of his personal heroes, Muhammad Ali and the Reverend Billy Graham. Taking a hands-on approach, John also came up with story ideas, wrote the editor's note, edited the copy, crafted headlines, and oversaw the layout of the magazine. He also picked up the phone to charm established writers into contributing to the magazine, and the biggest names in entertainment, politics, business, fashion, music, sports, and foreign affairs into being profiled in its pages. John clearly reveled in the fact that he was doing something wholly unexpected, something the die-hard Kennedy files, as he called them, might find unsettling. "I have a slightly contrarian impulse I can't seem to shake," he admitted. "It's kind of drenched in irony, right? Me in a media conglomerate." George racked up an unheard of 175 ad pages and sold out its first printing of 500,000 copies in days. A second printing of 100,000 copies was rushed out and vanished just as quickly from newsstands. By any measure, the magazine appeared to be a smash hit. Curiosity was the major selling factor, that and the simple fact that John was willing to do whatever it took to sell George to the American public. While he would never put himself on the cover, other magazines jumped at the chance. The week George went on sale, John graced the cover of New York Magazine, Esquire, and Newsweek. To hype his new creation, John, who had never agreed to do a lengthy television interview before, sat down before the cameras with Rosie O'Donnell, Oprah Winfrey, and Barbara Walters, to name a few. Sometimes the weight of expectations of doing anything, he confessed to the Washington Post, can be a little heavy. Determined to have some fun along the way, John seized the opportunity to make his TV acting debut on the hit primetime sitcom Murphy Brown. It was just 90 seconds, a quick cameo that had John offering Brown, played by Candice Bergen, a copy of George with her face on the cover. When John tells her he plans to give her a subscription as a wedding gift, Brown laughs it off. "Don't come crying to me," John tells her as he leaves in a huff, "when you have to pay full newsstand price." As he did everything he could to keep his magazine front and center, John seemed more and more confident that he'd made the right choice. "It's pretty cool," he said of his now all-consuming mission. "I think everyone needs to feel that they've created something that was their own, on their own terms." Rather than join the Kennedy clan, Carolyn and John spent Thanksgiving 1995 at a secluded resort in Honduras. The writer, Peter Alson, who was among the dozen or so friends who went along on the trip, casually asked John where he would normally be spending the Thanksgiving holiday. When John suddenly became emotional, Alson realized that the day was November 22nd, the 32nd anniversary of Dallas, and this was only the second Thanksgiving since Jackie passed away. Alson felt moved that his friend could even for a moment be so vulnerable. Increasingly, John was able to lose himself in his work, leaving Carolyn alone for longer and longer stretches of time. Unable to venture outside without being set upon by photographers, she spent hours at home with their black and white puppy named Friday. As smitten as she was with the dog, they were both insanely in love with Friday. He was more like a rambunctious child, a friend said. Carolyn felt trapped. Overnight, John Perry Barlow explained, Carolyn had become a thing in the eyes of the public, and she was treated accordingly. She had no concept of what it was going to be like. People camped out on your doorstep day and night. She felt like a refugee, or, as Carolyn herself put it, like a hunted animal. It didn't help that John, in addition to being absent much of the time, could also be massively inconsiderate. It was not uncommon for him to forget that they had plans for the evening and go straight from the office to the gym instead, leaving Carolyn to cool her heels for hours. Other times he might show up at home with dinner guests he had never bothered to tell her about, leaving Carolyn to scramble for something to serve. It wasn't that he was mean, one of their friends said. John was just like a little kid, and she was the grown-up. By early 1996, friends were noticing a distinct change in Carolyn's behavior. She was still warm and friendly and drop-dead gorgeous, one said, but now there were mood swings and periods of depression. She was upset, distracted. Everyone chalked it up to the pressures of being JFK Jr.'s fiancé. What they didn't know, and what she hadn't told John, was that she was pregnant. Had he known, John would have been thrilled. He'd been telling his closest friends for months that he was ready to become a father, and that he had even picked out a name that would work for both a boy and a girl, Flynn. The trouble was, Carolyn was not sure that she was ready for motherhood. Moreover, she worried about subjecting a child to the media onslaught that she was now struggling with. Carolyn, who had never told John that she'd already had 2 abortions, knew that he would never allow her to have a third. Their next big blow-up would have nothing to do with the baby issue, although the secret she was keeping from John must have contributed to Carolyn's precarious mental state. On February 25th, 1996, as they took a Sunday morning stroll with their dog Friday through New York's Washington Square Park, they both just snapped. Without warning, John grabbed Carolyn's hand and tore Jackie's swimming ring, their engagement ring, off her finger. "What's your problem?" Carolyn hollered at him. Then, as several bystanders looked on, John took the leash from her hand and stormed off with Friday. Screaming through her sobs, Carolyn chased John and grabbed him by the throat. The skirmish continued as they left the park, and eventually John, defeated, sat on the curb and cried. Carolyn walked up to him and demanded the ring. "Give it to me," she shouted. John did, and she knelt down next to him. They were both sobbing now, and for one tender moment it looked as if they had reconciled, until John pushed her away, reigniting the conflict. Carolyn grappled for the leash. "You've got your ring," he yelled. "You're not getting my dog." "It's our dog," she fired back before marching off with Friday. Later, Carolyn returned and led John to a bench for a quiet talk. Through their tears, they made up with a passionate embrace, also captured by photographers. An enterprising paparazzo had captured the entire incident on video, and what quickly became known as the brawl in the park was being talked about everywhere. Still trying to establish his credentials as a serious publishing executive, John was humiliated. "It was very undignified," John Perry Barlow said, and so unlike John. Just days after the tape was aired on national television, John appeared on Howard Stern's syndicated radio show. Had he seen the tape? The shock jock asked him. "I didn't have to see it," John replied coolly. "I was in it." Several weeks after their celebrated brawl, Carolyn miscarried. Although she had lived with John on North Moore Street, she had never given up her own one-bedroom in Greenwich Village. Instead of telling John about her pregnancy and miscarriage, she invited her ex-lover, Michael Bergen, to the apartment and told him everything. Then they made love and fell asleep in each other's arms. Early the next morning, a friend pounded on Carolyn's door, warning her that John was worried she hadn't returned home and was on his way over. Bergen, half-dressed, fled Carolyn's apartment in a panic. "I knew it was wrong, and she knew it was wrong," Bergen later reflected, "but we both found ways to justify our behavior." What did that say about their relationship? And what did it say about ours? Caroline Kennedy also had her doubts, fueled by the tabloid rumors, the controversial brawl in the park video, and the obvious hold Carolyn had over her brother. When friends asked if a wedding was imminent, Ed Schlossberg shot down the idea. "Caroline," he sniffed, "doesn't know her." Yet 1 week after Carolyn's tryst with Michael Bergen, she and John looked very much like a couple in love as they walked arm in arm along Paris's left bank. He had wanted to be at least an ocean away when some 1,195 lots from the estate of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis went under the gavel at Sotheby's in New York, the most ballyhooed estate sale in memory. The historic auction, which had Jackie's blessing, raised an astonishing $34 million, enough to pay off the taxes on the estate. Only $200,000 remained for John and Caroline from the sale. After all that, a lousy $100,000 each, John complained. Yet they still wound up splitting an after-tax estate of more than $100 million. It seemed unimaginable, but John and Carolyn had been married 2 full days before the press reported the story. To John's credit, their September 21st, 1996 wedding was pulled off with all the precision and stealth of a commando raid. It required the skill of a James Bond and the whole CIA, Tish Baldridge said. Jackie must be smiling in heaven. 3 days earlier, some 40 guests, mostly family, started arriving by private plane and boat on the tiny Cumberland Island, population 21, just off the Georgia coast. Everyone checked into the island's only hotel, the Grayfield Inn, which had once been the winter retreat of the Carnegie family. According to the caterer, Jody Sadowski, guests were forced to really rough it. The inn only has bathtubs. There's only one shower, and it's outdoors. So every morning, everyone stood in line. Maria Shriver was right behind me in her fuzzy slippers. That night, at the rehearsal dinner, John stood up to toast his bride. With a nod to the People magazine cover that launched him as a sex symbol, John declared himself to be the luckiest man alive. The next evening, John and Carolyn exchanged vows during a candlelight ceremony in the Brack Chapel of the First African Baptist Church, an unadorned white clapboard structure that had been built in 1893 by former slaves. John wore a midnight blue wool suit and white vest, one of his father's white shirts, and his father's watch. All of the men in the wedding party also wore a blue cornflower, JFK's favorite flower, as a boutonniere. Carolyn never stopped agonizing about the kind of life that lay ahead, the expectations, the loss of privacy, and how it all would affect any children they might have. Maintaining her own identity was another pressing issue for John's bride. While she and John were filling out the necessary paperwork and getting blood tests, the Camden County clerk, Shirley Wise, asked if Carolyn was taking John's surname. "I still want to be known as Bessette. Bessette Kennedy," she said. "I want the name with a hyphen." Wise was taken aback. "You could have knocked me over with a feather," she said. "After all this, she didn't want to take the world's most famous name?" Before the world knew of the wedding, and Carolyn was crowned the new Queen of Camelot by a hyperventilating press, they had embarked on their honeymoon, 3 days in Turkey, followed by a 10-day cruise of the Aegean aboard the 123-foot double-masted schooner Althea. Once they were back in New York, John and Carolyn stepped outside their Northmore Street building for the first time as man and wife. Polite to a fault, John gently pleaded with his fellow journalists as a solemn-faced Carolyn looked on. "This is a big change for anyone, and for a private citizen even more so," John told them. "I ask that you give Carolyn all the privacy and room you can." Not likely. As she tried to make her way into Caroline Kennedy's Park Avenue building for a post-wedding party, Carolyn was blinded by photographers' flashbulbs. "Please," she yelled as she shielded her eyes, "I can't see." It was clear from the outset that the photographers and reporters who were so charmed by John felt the opposite way about her. John was a real gentleman, photographer David Magot said. He was very polite to photographers at events, and he would stop and smile for them. He knew how to give, but she never did. She could be cold as ice. The grudge match between Carolyn and the press had been going on for quite some time. At first, she said she had viewed the paparazzi as kind of a joke, but then it just got bizarre. "I realized that a lot of the photographers really didn't like me. They wanted me to do something wrong so they could photograph it." She had a point. When she fell down the stairs outside 20 Northmore, photographers swung into action, but no one came to Carolyn's aid. "They just went crazy," said Carolyn, who pulled herself together and gathered up her belongings. "Nobody even helped me up. They just kept snapping." Now that she was Mrs. Bessette Kennedy, Carolyn had to put up with photographers shouting at her whore, bitch, and even more graphic expletives in an attempt to elicit an angry response. Jackie would have been sympathetic. She had fought for years to keep the press at bay, ultimately realizing that it was an unwinnable war. Rather than defeat the press, she had learned, at least to some extent, to manipulate it. Yet John understood that the ground rules had changed considerably since the days when, as the wife of a young senator bound for the White House, Jackie was first thrust into the limelight. Now, photographers were willing to do whatever it took to snare that dramatic photo that might fetch 6 figures from a tabloid. My wife went from being a private citizen to a public one overnight. It was taxing, John later said, not willing to publicly concede that she was cracking under the pressure. I have a thick skin about it, but I think people sort of forget how hard that can be. Carolyn is a very private woman, he said. It's like you go from having a life you've built on your own terms, and all of a sudden it's being snatched away from you. It's hard. Given enough time, Carolyn might have learned how to hide in plain sight from the master. John was a magician. He could just flat out disappear, John Perry Barlow said, recalling the time that photographers tried to corner the two friends as they left a Bruce Springsteen concert at Madison Square Garden. Barlow turned to talk to John, and he just vanished. While the paparazzi scattered to try and find him, Barlow heard someone whispering, "Psst, psst, over here." John then materialized from behind a concrete column. He'd been standing there right in the middle of everything the whole time, Barlow said. John knew how not to be seen if he didn't want to be seen, and he did it often. Knowing, as Jackie did, that the press always ramped up its coverage considerably whenever November 22nd rolled around, John spirited Carolyn out of town on the 33rd anniversary of his father's murder. This time they sneaked off to Indiana to visit Lloyd Howard, design engineer for Buckeye Industries. The year before, John purchased his first ultralight Buckeye-powered parachute, and since then, he and Howard had become good friends. "My mother was always afraid for me," John admitted to Howard. "She didn't want me flying." Howard believed John was more cautious than most people because of his mother. That was ingrained in him. He still heard her voice whispering in his ear, "Please be careful." Despite Howard's conviction that John was a cautious flyer, he actually had several close calls piloting his ultralight. In Hyannisport, police rushed to the Kennedy compound when locals dialed 911, claiming that a man flying a flimsy-looking contraption was being blown out over the Atlantic. Struggling with the controls, John finally guided the ultralight Buckeye back to land. "You could have been killed," one police officer told him. "I wasn't worried," John replied confidently. During the Kennedys' visit to Indiana, John also told Howard that he had every intention of running for office, although not right now. "My mom sort of pressured me to get into politics," he told Howard. "She expected me to follow in my father's footsteps, and of course I will, but I don't think the time is right just yet." Carolyn also exhibited a motherly concern for John's welfare that Jackie would have appreciated. She babied John. She treated him like her child, always asking how he felt, reminding him to wear a scarf, that sort of thing, Howard said. "I'd heard all the rumors about trouble in their marriage, but they said it wasn't true. They seemed to me to be about as in love with each other as two people could get." They now had new nicknames for each other. He called her Kitty Cat, and she called him Mouse. Yet for all the outward signs of marital bliss, the constant drumbeat of unsavory speculation continued. Carolyn was now said to be abusing drugs, specifically antidepressants and cocaine, to have suffered a miscarriage, which did turn out to be true, and to be seeking treatment for infertility. It was all clearly taking its toll. At one point, John jumped onto the hood of a Jeep being driven by celebrity photographer Angie Corcoran and banged on the window. Angie, he believed, had been responsible for the Brawl in the Park video. After screaming threats at her, "I know who you are and I'm going to get you," John grabbed her by the collar. Then he went after her male partner, screaming, "Leave us the hell alone." This time, Carolyn tried to stop her husband, but he would have none of it. Now furious at Carolyn, as well as the paparazzi, John took off alone, leaving his wife sobbing on the sidewalk. "I didn't blame him one bit for getting angry at me," Angie said later, who described John as being, quote, "gentle as a bunny with us, even when he was pissed off. He tried to strangle me, and I still love the guy. That's how great he was." John was not unaware of the effect he had on people, and now that George was well into its second year, John began to seriously consider a run for office. When New York's longtime Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan announced in 2000 that he would not seek re-election, Democratic leaders approached John. In January 1997, before Hillary Clinton expressed interest in the seat, John told New York State Democratic Chairwoman Judith Hope that he wanted to run for it. He had good reason to believe now was the time. A straw poll done at that time showed that out of all the probable Democratic candidates, including Hillary, John would win handily. While John now resolved to run for office, he also worked on keeping George afloat in the face of declining circulation and ad revenues. Carolyn, meanwhile, flew to Milan in July 1997 to attend the funeral of her friend, fashion designer Gianni Versace, who had been senselessly gunned down in front of his Miami Beach mansion. At the funeral, Carolyn just happened to be seated directly behind Princess Diana. Not long before, Diana had praised Jackie for the way she raised her children and said she hoped that her sons, William and Harry, would be able to handle the media as gracefully as John had. 5 weeks after Carolyn spoke briefly with Diana in Milan, the Princess of Wales was killed in a car crash after a high-speed chase through the streets of Paris. Like many, Carolyn blamed the paparazzi. "I'm not sure what I'm going to do about Carolyn," John told Billy Noonan. "She's really spooked now." Princess Diana's death only served to harden Carolyn's resolve not to have children anytime soon. "How can I bring JFK III into this world?" she asked. "They'll never leave me alone. Having a child would be just too cruel," she added. "Just another form of child abuse." These are not the words Jackie probably would have wanted to hear. As First Lady and the widow of an assassinated president, she faced unimaginable hardships, yet somehow still succeeded in raising 2 happy, well-adjusted children. Jackie had accomplished this, of course, by shielding John and Caroline from their problematic Kennedy cousins, who seemed to be getting into more trouble now than ever. Michael Kennedy, the 6th of Bobby and Ethel's 11, now stood accused of sleeping with his family's underage babysitter. Michael's older brother, Joe, meanwhile, he was under fire for engineering the annulment of his 12-year marriage to Sheila Rausch, an unfolding scandal that would cause Joe to drop out of the race for Massachusetts governor. What John did next probably would have horrified Jackie, who, if not always enthusiastic about supporting her Kennedy in-laws, never publicly criticized them. In an effort to generate controversy and give newsstand sales a much-needed shot in the arm, John used the editorial page of George to savage his cousins, calling them poster boys for bad behavior. To ensure that his piece would garner maximum attention, John posed in the nude, albeit discreetly obscured by a shadow, for the accompanying photograph. Under the headline, "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree," John was shown sitting on the ground, his gaze directed upward at the forbidden fruit. Joe Kennedy's retort was brief and stinging. "Ask not what you can do for your cousin," he sneered, "but what you can do for his magazine." As the 1997 holidays approached, there were more heated confrontations with the press. One afternoon, John turned a video camera on the paparazzi and threatened to use it as Exhibit A in a lawsuit against them. Carolyn grew so fed up that at one point she chased down a female photographer, grabbed her by the shoulders, and spit in her face. Confronted with tensions at the office, the ever-insatiable tabloid press, and mounting strain in his marriage, John sought avenues of escape. In December, he secretly began taking flying lessons at the Flight Safety Academy in Vero Beach, Florida. Carolyn shared Jackie's concerns about the notoriously unfocused John piloting a plane. "I mean it, John. I have a bad feeling about this," she was overheard telling him the day after Christmas, 1997. "I don't want you taking flying lessons." With some additional prodding from Uncle Teddy, John promised to give up his dream of piloting his own plane. For the time being, he claimed, he was willing to settle for flying the Buckeye Ultralight, his aptly nicknamed flying lawnmower, which did not require a pilot's license. Not all risks required leaving the ground. The family curse reared its head yet again on New Year's Eve, when Michael Kennedy, vacationing with his family in Aspen, slammed headlong into a tree while playing a typically reckless Kennedy game of night football on skis. John's cousin Rory desperately tried to revive her brother with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. When that failed, she cradled Michael's bleeding head as his children knelt in the snow, crying. At Michael's funeral on Cape Cod, John appeared far more distraught than he had been at any of the previous funerals he'd attended, even his mother's. After the service, John, who was weeping openly, threw his arms around Douglas Kennedy, one of Michael's brothers. His eldest brother Joe, clearly unimpressed, ignored his Kennedy Bouvier cousin. Michael's death only made those who loved John more aware than ever that he was tempting fate by taking to the skies, even in the ultralight that didn't require a pilot's license. Carolyn never stopped hinting at her concern. At her 32nd birthday party, Carolyn paused before blowing out the candles on her cake. "What's your wish?" he asked. "To know," she said, "that you'll always be around." A month later, they were among the guests invited to attend a state dinner for British Prime Minister Tony Blair at the White House. "Did John remember living here?" someone asked. "Only vaguely," he said. "Did he want to again?" "Only vaguely," John smiled. That final year, John and Carolyn seemed, on balance, to be happier than they had ever been. At the White House Correspondents Association dinner that spring, she plopped into John's lap and they cuddled and giggled for the cameras. The reason for Carolyn's positive new attitude, she told the New York Daily News, was that she simply stopped reading what was written about her in the newspapers. Unlike Jackie, who eagerly lapped up every syllable, Carolyn claimed that she was, quote, a happier person and maybe a better person for just not knowing. That, and the fact that Carolyn was now taking antidepressants, recreational drugs were no longer in the picture, and undergoing intense psychotherapy 5 days a week. Even with all the pharmaceutical and psychiatric help, it was difficult to hear what John had to tell her that April. Not only had he reneged on his promise to give up his flying lessons, but John had already secretly earned his pilot's license. John's sister Caroline told a friend that she felt like crying when she heard the news. "You know Mommy didn't want you to fly," she told John. "I think you know how angry she'd be with you right now and how worried she'd be." Although there had always been tension between Carolyn and Caroline, this was one subject on which they agreed. After a time, however, it became clear that there was nothing either one of them could do or say to change his mind. The only person who would have succeeded in doing that was Jackie. Not that any friend or fellow Kennedy was particularly eager to fly with the novice aviator, no matter how hard he tried to convince them that it was perfectly safe. John may have pushed his limitations getting his pilot's license, Willie Smith said, half in jest, but he hasn't overcome them yet. He's yet to persuade any of his relatives to fly with him. In 1998, John took to the skies alone in his new Cessna with N 529 JK on the fuselage, a reference to his father's May 29th birthday. In time, he was able to persuade a handful of acquaintances to join him. All summer long, John buzzed Redgate Farm, recalled his Martha's Vineyard neighbor, Tony DiLorenzo. Not only that, John would buzz it, go up, dive down, and show all his friends where his house was. By the summer of 1999, John was back in the skies over his mother's house, swooping down and pulling up at the last minute, only now in his more powerful, souped-up Piper Saratoga. A great guy, DiLorenzo said, but sadly, he was a showboater. The couple would rendezvous at Redgate Farm nearly every weekend that summer. Carolyn flew up with him in the Piper Saratoga a few times, but only when an instructor tagged along, or if John was flying without a co-pilot, strictly during daylight hours. That summer of 1999, Carolyn and John hosted two very special guests on the vineyard. Tony Radziwill had been battling cancer for more than a decade, but now the outcome was clear. Tony's illness was really tearing John up, John Perry Barlow said. He did everything he could for Tony, but he knew he was dying. At John's insistence, Tony Radziwill was spending his final few weeks with his wife, Carol, at Redgate Farm. It's what Mummy would have wanted, John told Carolyn. She loved Tony like a son. The imminent loss of his surrogate brother was not the only cross John had to bear that summer. In addition to the nonstop round of galas, openings, and fundraisers in New York, Boston, and Washington, John was in the process of buying out his sister's share in Redgate Farm. Now, he and Caroline were reportedly squabbling over certain items of furniture that were left to them by their mother. John confided in his cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that he was hurt by his sister Caroline's actions, while Carolyn told Bobby's wife, Mary, that the bitter feud with his sister over Jackie's belongings had left John so depressed that he was finding it hard to function. He's under a lot of stress, you know, Carolyn explained, and it's killing him. One of the biggest challenges facing John was finding a way to save George from extinction. After a wildly successful beginning, fueled almost entirely by John's celebrity and personal charisma, the magazine, which never quite found its footing with advertisers, was drowning in a sea of red ink. Now Hachette was ready to pull the plug, forcing John to scramble for investors to keep George alive. He loves his staff, Carolyn told one of her Fashion World friends. He'll feel terrible if they lose their jobs. He'll feel responsible. By mid-July, however, John realized he was fighting a losing battle. He was ready to shut the magazine down and finally make the big leap into politics. Only months before, John Perry Barlow and former Republican Senator from New York, Alphonse D'Amato, teamed up to convince John to run for mayor of New York City as a Republican. John was actually really thinking it over, Barlow said. In many ways, John was quite conservative. Socially, I think he was more of a Republican than a Democrat. He would have made a great mayor. He really understood New York, and he loved it deeply. In the end, John was still convinced that his best shot was at running for Daniel Patrick Moynihan's Senate seat. Hillary Clinton had hesitated to enter the race largely because she feared John, who was being touted behind the scenes as her principal rival for the nomination, would be a formidable foe. John was both heir to the Kennedy magic and people's sexiest man alive, as well as the consummate New Yorker, a resident of the city since the age of 3. Although New York had no residency requirements, Hillary, who had never spent more than a few days at a time in New York, would almost certainly be branded as a carpetbagger. There were other, more personal reasons for Hillary's initial reluctance to battle John for the nomination. She and Bill had forged a very close friendship with Jackie, and Hillary felt a special attachment to her children. Caroline, in fact, had become a close confidant of first daughter Chelsea Clinton. She was really torn, said one of Hillary's supporters in New York. She liked John and hated the idea of running against him, and she also felt that he would be impossible to beat on his home turf. This had been Bobby Kennedy's seat, Hillary pointed out, and she felt if John wanted it, he should have it. As late as the summer of 1999, Hillary actively worried about JFK Jr. and sought assurances from state party officials that he would not be a last-minute entry into the race. People love John, she conceded, more than they love me. Ed Koch agreed. I love Hillary, he said, but if John Kennedy had been in the race, there's no way she would have won the nomination. He had the Kennedy name and a charisma all his own. The Senate seat was his for the asking. In early July, Hillary finally made her move and formally announced her candidacy. But she was still concerned about the possibility that John just might decide to toss his hat into the ring. As it turned out, she was right. John was now more confident than ever that he could easily beat her in the polls. He believed Hillary was vulnerable, not because of the Monica Lewinsky affair, her husband's subsequent impeachment, and a slew of brewing scandals in the Clinton White House, but mainly because she simply had no connection to the state he loved. As Hillary feared, young Kennedy planned on making much of Hillary's carpetbagger status. Wait until she gets here, John told his friend Billy Noonan. She's going to get her head handed to her. He was going to fill Noonan in on the details of his upcoming campaign for the U.S. Senate, how and when he intended to make the announcement, what advice he was getting from Uncle Teddy, the endorsements and the backing he was already lining up when they all got together on Nantucket to celebrate Noonan's 5th wedding anniversary on July 16th. Then they'd be off to attend his cousin Rory's wedding in Hyannisport. If, of course, all went according to plan. And that, my friends, is where I'm going to leave John's story. We all know what happened after that. If you are interested to learn more about the plane crash that killed John and Carolyn and her sister Lauren, listen to episode 1 of the series. We did this sort of backwards. I decided to start at the end of his life and work my way backwards for this series. So if you missed episode 1 and you're interested in the plane crash, go back and listen to that episode. But I think that's a good place to leave it with that big what if that's in all of our minds and our hearts for the last 26 years since we lost John. And before I get emotional and start crying, I think I'll close this series. I want to thank you very much for listening. It felt good to share, to talk about my old friend John. I still miss him so much. Man, I wish he was here. I wish he would have had that chance to run for Senate, for president. And I often think about how different our world might be today had John lived. So with that said, thank you very much for listening. I'm Lori Spencer, and I'll see you soon. Take care.